The Book of Enoch had to be removed because
these things like the Book of Enoch or
No one could explain why it glowed red, while everything else in the sky did not.
Mars is a planet scientists have been staring at for decades, trying to piece together how a world that once had rivers and a thick atmosphere ended up as the cold, dusty red desert we see through our telescopes and rovers today. But there is a strange thread running alongside the science that keeps pulling people's attention in a very different direction, an ancient religious text called the Book of Enoch, filled with descriptions of heavens, gates, wandering beings, and a ruined, desolate place far from where those beings started. None of this was written with Mars in mind. Nobody carving these stories thousands of years ago had ever seen a photograph of a red planet or measured its atmosphere. And yet, when people lay the old descriptions next to what modern missions have revealed about Mars, the coincidences are eerie enough that the comparison keeps resurfacing online again and again. This is not a claim that ancient scribes secretly knew astrophysics. It is an exploration of why two very different stories, one religious, one scientific, end up sounding oddly similar when you put them side by side. To understand why the comparison even exists, you first have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is, because most people have only heard the name in passing without knowing its real history. Enoch is not part of the Bible that most Christians and Jews read today, but it was clearly influential once. The text describes a figure named Enoch being taken on tours through the heavens, shown the structure of the sky, and introduced to a group of angelic beings called the Watchers, who eventually abandon their assigned place and descend to Earth. It is a strange, layered work, blending cosmology, prophecy, and a warning about beings who cross boundaries they were never meant to cross. For early Christian communities in the first few centuries after Jesus, Enoch was read and quoted, but as church leadership matured and doctrine solidified, influential figures such as Athanasius of Alexandria and Jerome grew uneasy with its content. The idea of angels taking physical form, walking among humans, and fathering children did not sit well with the emerging theological consensus, and over time the book was pushed out of the Western canon. In most of Europe, it effectively vanished, remembered only through a handful of quotations preserved in other ancient writings. What almost nobody in the West realized was that the book never actually disappeared, it simply kept being copied somewhere else. Ethiopian Christian communities preserved the complete text in the ancient Guizi language for well over 1,000 years, continuing to treat it as scripture long after Western Europe had forgotten it existed. It took a Scottish traveler named James Bruce, who journeyed through Ethiopia in the 1770s, to bring the book back into European scholarly awareness. Bruce returned with copies of the full text, and suddenly a work many assumed was permanently lost was back in circulation among historians and theologians. Even then, one nagging question remained: was the Ethiopian version an authentic preservation of a genuinely ancient text, or had later scribes reshaped and expanded it well beyond its original form? That question was not resolved until the 20th century, when the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran in 1947 turned up fragments of Enoch dating back centuries earlier than the Ethiopian manuscripts. Suddenly scholars had physical, datable evidence that this strange book of heavens and fallen beings had genuinely circulated in the ancient world, not just in medieval copies. That is the real, well-documented history behind the book, and it is worth being clear about, because the more speculative comparisons to Mars only make sense once you understand that this text is authentically old, not a modern fabrication. Once you actually read through Enoch's content rather than just hearing about its reputation, one of the most surprising things is how much space it dedicates to astronomy rather than morality tales. In a section often called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, Enoch is guided by an angelic figure named Uriel, who walks him through the movements of the sun, moon, and stars as though explaining a mechanical system. The text describes celestial bodies passing through specific gates or openings in the sky, following fixed paths, governed by a calendar built around roughly 364 days. To modern eyes, it reads almost like someone trying to describe orbital mechanics with the only vocabulary available in the ancient world, the language of gates, paths, and assigned positions. Naturally, given the tools available at the time, there was no way for its authors to have accurate knowledge of orbital dynamics. What they produced was a symbolic, structured picture of order in the heavens, built from careful naked eye observation rather than physics. That obsession with cosmic order matters because it sets up the central conflict in the story. Some heavenly beings refuse to stay within that order. According to the text, a group of watchers, roughly 200 of them, led by a figure named Shemihaza, gathered at Mount Hermon and made a pact to descend to earth and take human wives, defying the position they had been assigned. Their arrival brought consequences far beyond a broken vow. One watcher, Azazel, is blamed for teaching humanity how to forge metal into weapons, while others are associated with spreading astrology, divination, and other forms of forbidden knowledge. The children born from these unions were described as giants, violent and insatiable, and their growing destruction eventually forced heaven to intervene. Archangels including Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel are sent to bind the watchers and destroy the giants, and the rebellious beings are cast out, not simply erased, but exiled to a desolate, ruined place, cut off from the ordered heavens they once belonged to. It's that detail, being sent away to a barren, stripped-down world after abandoning their proper place, that has drawn comparisons to Mars, because Mars really does have a documented history of losing something essential that once protected it. Billions of years ago, based on evidence gathered from orbiters, landers, and rover missions, Mars appears to have had a much thicker atmosphere along with flowing water on its surface, conditions dramatically different from the freezing, dry world we observe today. Scientists studying this transformation, including researchers working with NASA's MAVEN mission, have built a fairly well-supported picture of what happened. Mars once had a global magnetic field generated by activity in its core, and that field acted as a shield, deflecting the solar wind, a constant stream of charged particles flowing outward from the sun. As the Martian interior cooled over time, that internal dynamo weakened and the global magnetic field faded away. Without that protective shield, the solar wind could interact directly with the upper atmosphere, gradually stripping away atmospheric particles into space over an enormous span of time. The result was a thinning atmosphere, a cooling surface, and the eventual loss of the conditions needed to keep liquid water stable on the surface, leaving behind the cold, dry, dust-covered planet that spacecraft photographed today. It's not hard to see why some readers find the comparison tempting, a text describing a world that loses its order and protection, cast out and left barren, sitting next to a real planet that lost its own protective shield and turned into a barren husk of what it once was. It's worth being honest, though, about what that comparison actually is, a resemblance in imagery, not a scientific claim. Enoch's authors were not describing Mars specifically, they never mention a red planet, a fourth world from the sun, or anything resembling modern planetary terminology. What they were doing was building a story about cosmic order, rebellion, and consequence, using the sky itself as the stage. The similarity that people notice is really a similarity in the shape of the story, protection lost, world ruined, rather than any specific, verifiable detail that lines up with Martian geology. That distinction matters, because treating a coincidence in imagery as proof of hidden ancient knowledge is very different from acknowledging that humans across history have often reached for similar metaphors when trying to describe destruction and desolation. Mars offers plenty of other features that fuel this kind of speculation, and most of them have far more mundane explanations once you look closely. One of the most dramatic is Valles Marineris, an enormous canyon system that stretches for roughly 4,000 kilometers across the Martian surface and plunges several kilometers deep in places, dwarfing the Grand Canyon by a wide margin. Planetary scientists generally attribute its formation to tectonic stretching and cracking of the Martian crust, likely linked to the massive volcanic uplift in the nearby Tharsis region, where the added weight and stress on the crust caused it to fracture over time. It is a genuinely spectacular scar left by real geological processes, not evidence of some cataclysmic battle, but its scale alone is enough to make people wonder what kind of violent history could carve a wound that size into a planet. Then there's Cydonia, a region that became a pop culture flashpoint back in 1976, when NASA's Viking 1 orbiter captured an image of a mesa that, under a particular lighting angle, resembled a human face staring up from the Martian surface. Nearby formations that some viewers interpreted as pyramid-like shapes only added fuel to speculation that intelligent beings might once have built structures there. The excitement was understandable, but it did not hold up under better evidence. When NASA later photographed the same region with sharper cameras and different lighting conditions, the face resolved into an ordinary, naturally eroded landform, no different in essence from countless other mesas shaped by wind and geological processes elsewhere on Mars. The episode is a useful reminder of how easily human brains find faces and patterns in ambiguous shapes, a phenomenon well documented in psychology, and how quickly a striking image can outrun the evidence behind it. Mars's two small moons, Phobos and Deimos, add another layer to the mythology surrounding the planet, and this part of the story is genuinely strange even without any embellishment. Both moons are tiny, irregularly shaped, and dark, first spotted in 1877 by American astronomer Asaph Hall. Their names come straight out of Greek mythology, where Phobos and Deimos were the sons of Ares, the god of war, later identified with the Roman god Mars, a naming choice that feels almost too fitting for a planet nicknamed the Red Planet. Phobos in particular stands out for its orbital behavior. It circles Mars in roughly 7.5 hours, faster than Mars itself completes a single rotation, which means that from the Martian surface, Phobos appears to rise in the west and set in the east, the reverse of what we're used to seeing with Earth's moon. Its surface is heavily cratered and marked by long grooves, and scientists still debate its origin, with leading theories suggesting it is either a captured asteroid pulled into orbit by Mars's gravity or debris thrown into orbit following a major impact on the planet. Some speculative writers have floated the idea that Phobos's unusual shape hints at an artificial origin, but that idea has never been backed by peer-reviewed evidence, and the scientific consensus remains firmly on the side of natural formation processes. What is well established is that Phobos is slowly spiraling closer to Mars and will likely break apart or collide with the planet at some point in the distant future. So where does that leave the actual question posed by this comparison? Did an ancient religious text somehow anticipate the scientific story of Mars? The honest answer is no, not in any literal sense. There is no credible historical or scientific evidence that the authors of Enoch had any knowledge of Mars's atmospheric history, its lost magnetic field, or its geology. What the comparison really reveals is something more human. Across very different eras, using very different tools, people have consistently returned to the same basic story when trying to make sense of ruin and loss, a place that once had order and protection, followed by an event that stripped that protection away, followed by a barren aftermath. Ancient writers built that story out of theology, judgment, and cosmic order because that was the framework available to them. Modern scientists reconstruct a similar arc for Mars using magnetometer data, atmospheric modeling, and images sent back across millions of kilometers of space. Both are genuine attempts to explain the unknown using the best tools of their time, but only one of them is built on testable, physical evidence that can be checked, revised, and confirmed through repeated observation. That does not make the comparison pointless, though. It says something interesting about how deeply the idea of a fallen, desolate world runs through human storytelling, and it says something about how satisfying it is to find a pattern that seems to connect an ancient mystery to a modern one. The Book of Enoch survived an extraordinary journey to reach us, pushed out of the Western canon, preserved for centuries by Ethiopian Christians, rediscovered by a Scottish explorer, and finally confirmed as genuinely ancient by fragments buried in caves near the Dead Sea for 2,000 years. Mars, meanwhile, is still being actively studied by orbiters and rovers piecing together exactly how and when it lost its atmosphere and its water. Neither story is finished. Scholars continue debating what Enoch's original authors intended and how later communities reinterpreted it, while planetary scientists continue refining the timeline of Mars's transformation from a wetter world into the desert we see now. In the end, the connection between an ancient book about fallen angels and a real planet stripped of its atmosphere is best understood as a striking coincidence in imagery rather than a hidden prophecy. It's a reminder that humans have always looked at the sky and tried to explain what they couldn't fully understand, whether with angels and gates in the heavens or with magnetometers and orbital spacecraft. The tools have changed enormously, but the impulse to find meaning in a ruined, desolate world hasn't gone anywhere. Whether you see the resemblance as pure coincidence or as evidence of something deeper about how humans process catastrophe and loss, both the ancient text and the real planet still have plenty of